The first hymn will be, I'm kidding. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. Good to be together. And welcome to Rabbi Ezring. He's been with us many times. I've been at his place many times. Always have a great time. He has a brilliant, inventive mind, and it's just good to be able to get together and talk about these things together. A lot of us are Methodist. I know there's some other Christian people who are not Methodist. You can still step up, see the light one day. And we have friends from Temple as well. So glad that you're all here. Make it a point on your way out. Don't talk to somebody you know. Find somebody that you don't know and make a friend on the way out. Let me mention two things. One is to refer back to last week. This is a three-part series, kind of, although you did just one at a time. A week ago, Dr. Ben Witherington was with us, gave a really just stunning lecture, if you were here. And some of you know this news. The next night, I got a call from Ben. He was in tears. His daughter, Christy, 32 years old, had been found dead from an embolism. Great tragedy. They're in Kentucky today. We'll have service for her tomorrow. But you want to lift up the Witherington family. Joyce, of course, his mother's a member of our church. They're having difficult days. Next week, on Monday, we're having a repeat of a program that we did earlier on Heaven and Hell. It's kind of the four amigos, the four male clergy here, the young guys and me. Shane and George and Kevin and myself will be talking about various aspects of Jesus, what the church has believed about Jesus, what that means for us in our lives. And those guys have just brilliant minds, and I'll be moderating and helping that along. So come back next Monday for that. So tonight we're going to talk about the Messiah. Murray and I always scrounging around for good topics to talk about. This seems like a great one, right, for Jews and Christians to talk about together. So we're going to begin with Murray, who's going to talk some, and then I'm going to share some, and then we'll have you talk with us. And we'll look forward to that. So, Murray, welcome.
Is this working? Oh, good, because I can't hear it. But I don't have to. I hear myself talk all the time. By the way, next week, would someone be willing to drop me a note and let me know which of the four of them was right? It would be very interesting. When I was a little boy, I was taught that we all are waiting for the Messiah. And I remember asking my dad as we were walking to services one Saturday morning, what's the big deal about the Messiah? He said, oh, it'll be the end of days. And I said, Dad, that doesn't sound very good. What do you mean by the end of days? He said, oh, no. That's when heaven will come to earth. I said, okay, we're getting a little bit better now, Dad. What does that mean? And we stopped our walk, and he looked at me, and he said, Murray, the days of the Messiah will be the time that every day is Shabbat. Every day is the Sabbath. You won't have to worry about working. There will always be wonderful food on the table and drink for everyone. No one will ever get sick again, and that's what we're waiting for. I thought, what a wonderful vision. And it wasn't for many years that I realized my dad was only taking part of the Bible out of context. And in fact, there are two prophetic visions of what the Messianic era will be like, or at least how we will enter into it. Anyone here ever heard of Gog and Magog or Armageddon? Well, that's one. Ezekiel likes violent, messy pictures. It's exciting, gets everyone's attention, right? Isaiah, on the other hand, keeps talking about the wolf lying down with the lamb, the lion eating straw, this wonderful transition into a peaceful existence for everyone and every creature. And in fact, when I study my Bible carefully, it's very clear that there were two distinct, different prophetic impressions of what that Messianic era will be. But that's not the topic for tonight. Tonight's topic is, what is the Messiah? Now, I have tried to write as neatly as I can here because in the Bible and in Jewish history, the Messiah is a three-stage process in development. What is it? Well, the first time the concept of Mashiach comes into existence is in the time of David, kind of. See, prior to David, there were two people who were Messiahed or anointed. And they were the king of Israel and the high priest of Israel. Who was the first person in the Bible that we read about who was anointed and is a messianic figure? Aaron, the high priest of Israel, is anointed by David during the dedication of the tabernacle. After that point, the political head of Israel and the religious head are both anointed with oil. But it really doesn't mean much other than the establishment of a role in the community until the time of David, because God makes promises to David and his family. And the promises are very, very carefully made. We are told that David's rule of Israel will be eternal. And as long as he or his descendants behave properly and act properly, the messianic rule of Israel, that anointed rule of king, will never leave the family of David. And then we come to a stage in history which creates many difficulties for the Jewish people, and that is the great King Solomon, the man of wisdom, right? Has anyone here ever read all those great decisions of King Solomon? Whoa. Let's see. You guys, for the next 6 months, have to work at building the temple. Forget your jobs and homes. You come to Jerusalem. You guys, for the next 6 months, have to pay for all that stuff they're going to be building. And at the end of 6 months, it flip-flops. So when Solomon finally passes away and his son becomes king of Israel, the people come to him and complain bitterly about the taxation, the forced labor, and he says, "You think my daddy was bad? Just wait." And the kingdom splits in half. And that, for a long period of time, is truly the end of the Davidic dream, of the concept of the anointed king of David as being in power in Israel. And that's why we come to stage 2. After Israel loses its strength, its power, and is continually attacked, is put into Babylonian exile, etc., all of a sudden, what do the people want? They want stage 2. Can't have stage 1. So they look for the return of the Davidic king and the reestablishment of the Davidic monarchy and the Davidic power. And this is, again, very clear. By the way, who was the last Davidic ruler of Israel? This is an easy question, actually. A guy by the name of Zerubbabel. He came... They never listen, do they, James? Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the last known prince by lineage of the people of Israel. And he comes back from Babylonian exile in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah when Cyrus says it's okay to go. And he comes. He returns to Israel and then disappears from history. We know nothing about what happens once he gets back. He's gone. The Davidic line appears to be gone completely from history. Now, I do want to take a sidestep here because anyone here know that name Cyrus I just mentioned? Cyrus has a distinction that no one else in the universe has ever had that I know of. Anyone know what that distinction is? He was called in the Bible the anointed of God. He was Mashiach. He was a Messiah, anointed by God without oil And the reason he was viewed as such was because he sent Israel back to Israel. Which means that in biblical times, the use of that term Messiah or Mashiach is really strange. It doesn't just refer to David. It doesn't just refer to the high priest of Israel. It can refer to anyone that God decides should be an anointed. And then, by the way, if you want to look some of this up in your Bibles, Amos chapter 9, especially verses 11 to 12, Isaiah 11, verse 10, 9, verses 1 to 7, 16, 4 to 5, 11, 1 following, Hosea 3, 5, Ezekiel 37, 15 following, etc., etc., etc. This concept is raised over and over and over again that we're now looking for a return to Zion under Davidic leadership. Now, stage 3, that's really the stage that we're most interested in. And the problem with that stage is that it's post-biblical. What the rabbis taught was different from what the Bible taught. And in fact, there were lots of different theories. In the Dead Sea sect, they talked about 2 messiahs. And we always thought that was kind of strange in Jewish life until later we found out they weren't the only ones. If you go back through the sectarian texts of ancient Israel after the Roman destruction of the temple, you will find many sects believed in 2 messiahs, a messiah of the house of Joseph and a messiah of the house of David. So who's this guy Joseph? Anyone know which the largest, strongest tribe of ancient Israel was? The tribe of Ephraim. Had the largest army, was a strong tribe, but it was part of the 10 that disappeared. The Messiah for the house of Joseph is the man who will bring back the 10 lost tribes, especially the tribe of Ephraim, to unify the people Israel so that they will be strong once again and be able to have their own monarchy. And by the time we come to Bar Kokhba around 135 CE or AD in your terms, Bar Kokhba is a Messiah. They even convinced Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Azariah and all the rabbis of the time that he was the Messiah, and everyone went to war against Rome, succeeded in throwing off the shackles of Rome for a brief time. And Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. There was only one itty-bitty, teeny-weeny little problem with Bar Kokhba. He wasn't from the house of David. And therefore, in all the literature about Bar Kokhba, he never claims to be king of Israel. He only claims to be the Nasi, the leader, the prince, the president, so to speak. And so from this point on, it's the personal traits of the individual that are often more important during the Middle Ages when we're talking about a Messiah. We've had many false messiahs. A man by the name of Shabtai Tzvi during the Islamic period marched across Islam with tens of thousands of Jews following him back to Israel. And then one day the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire confronts him with his army and he says, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm the Messiah." He says, "Are you really?" He said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Good, I'm going to let you prove it. I'm going to give you a choice. I'll kill you now, or you can repent your claim to the Messiahhood, or you can prove you're the Messiah by jumping into this boiling vat of oil and staying there for 10 minutes. And when you come out and you're whole and happy, we'll believe you." He relented on his claim. And so it was a series of medieval false messiahs that we were confronted with because from the time of Zerubbabel, no one was capable of tracing their lineage back to King David, except for me. And that's serious. I can do it. Even though I'm from the tribe of Levi, I can do it. I have my mother's family tree. My mother's family tree goes back to the 16th century, the 1500s, to the rabbis of Charlap in the Balkans. And the rabbis of Charlap in the Balkans trace their history all the way back to King David. The secret is they never told anyone how. Okay, it's an impossible claim, but I can make it. It's in the history books. My family is a direct descendant of King David. So if the position is still open, I would be willing to talk about, as long as there are no vats of boiling oil involved. And that's the problem we run into, though. If, as the Bible states, that it's the relationship to King David that is most important, and if, as the medieval and earlier rabbis believe, that when the Messiah comes, all those things from the vision of Isaiah will come true, it means either we're out of hope or God will, like he did with Cyrus, point out a Messiah to us. Your turn.
I always, in these moments, think of an anecdote that I know a few of you have heard me tell before, but it always bears repeating. The great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber was speaking to a group of Roman Catholic priests up in New York. This is back in the 50s. And he was doing Q&A afterwards, and somebody asked him about the Messiah. And he said the following. He said, now, we believe the Messiah has not come, and we're waiting for the Messiah. You believe that the Messiah has come, and you're waiting for him to return. He said, I propose that we wait for him together. And then when he comes, we can ask him, were you here before? And then he added, he said, and I hope for the love of God, I'm next to him and I can whisper in his ear, please don't answer. So, Messiah. Murray can do this without notes. I have to have paper. So, Christians, how should we say it? How do Christians think about this? There's kind of a kind of primitive way that some Christians, if you had just a little dabble of knowledge, might think about Jesus as the Messiah. And the story goes like this, and it's a grossly inadequate way, but I'll just kind of tell you how it is. I think I grew up kind of overhearing this, is that for a long time, Jews were looking for the Messiah, and it was predicted in the Old Testament, and they were just waiting for him to come. And Jesus appeared, and he totally fulfilled all those hopes for what the Messiah would be. So they believed, and they said, yes, he is the Messiah, except there was a problem, which is that there were some people then who did not believe. They didn't buy it. They didn't accept it. And according to the Christians, like how mistaken could you be? How catastrophically dumb not to be able to recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. And it gets downright ugly at times. There are nuances within the New Testament itself. You know, John chapter 8 talks about the Jews who didn't accept that Jesus was the Messiah, and they're portrayed as being evil because of this. And we don't need to chronicle again, you know, how history has unfolded because of such attitudes, you know, atrocities that are an embarrassment to humanity. There's some better ways to think about this. Let me just go through a few things that I jotted down here. Did Christians think that Jesus was the Messiah? Well, it's hard to say they didn't, because Jesus, he kind of takes on this last name early on. He's Jesus Christ, and Christ means Messiah. The Hebrew word Mashiach, when it's translated into Greek, becomes Christos. So his name virtually is Jesus Messiah, Jesus Christ. So surely the early Christians thought that Jesus was the Messiah. The question that we have to ask is, what did that mean to them internally? When they said it, what did they mean? And what does it mean for us? And what does that mean in relation to ancient Judaism, but I would say even more importantly for contemporary Judaism? How do we think about this? Now, we know a fair amount about Jewish messianic expectation. Maria has talked some about it. I jotted down what is taught in seminary nowadays about messianic expectation. That's pretty important. We learn, for instance, that there's no one Judaism You know, if I said Christianity is one thing, you would laugh over this because, you know, there are all kinds of Christian groups. I mean, there are Catholics and Lutherans and Southern Baptism, all kinds of people we let in. And work with me on this. And in the same way, there was no one Judaism even during the time of Jesus. You had the Essenes at Qumran, and you had Sadducees and different ways of being Jewish. So there's no one messianic expectation. You had people who said that they were the Messiah, and that wasn't all that unusual. Names of people like Simon ben Giora, Theudas, Judas, Bar Kokhba that Murray mentioned. There were different expectations. Some expected a king, a Davidic king to come, but there also was messianic expectation that there would be a priest, a messianic priest who would come. Some expected a messianic prophet to come, as Murray said at Qumran. The Jews there expected 2 messiahs. What it really is about is an expectation of an age when everything would be transformed. Some of it was because of dissatisfaction with the existing rulers in the world. I was thinking about how messianic expectation must have developed. You know, there was a Messiah, the anointed one, the current king in Israel, and he turned out to be a dud. And then the next one turned out to be a dud as well. And the next is kind of like, you know, Republican candidates coming forward. It's a Republican crowd, I can tell. It's just how it is. And so there kept being disappointed. So then the hope comes that one day there will be this great Messiah, one who will truly be who that Messiah is supposed to be. What's interesting in all of this is that Murray, correct me on this, every messianic expectation is that the Messiah will be a human person. It's not a divine being coming down from heaven. The Messiah always is human. So we look at Jesus, and the question we could ask is, does Jesus fit any of this complex messianic expectation that was alive and well when Jesus was on earth? And the question and the answer to that is there was not much of a good fit at all between what people expected the Messiah to be and who Jesus actually was. His words didn't match what messiahs were supposed to say. His actions certainly didn't. His suffering, his poverty. Jesus was a pretty apolitical character, but the Messiah, by definition, was supposed to be a political person. So he was not the Messiah on classic Jewish terms. This applies to him and his own fate. I mean, if you think about the life of Jesus, we glamorize it because we have art and everything else, we believe in the resurrection. But if you just charted the actual earthly success of Jesus, like you wouldn't want your child to turn out this way, right? He starts off with a pretty good following, but then even his followers drift away because they don't get him and they abandon him. Even those closest to him have no clue what he's about, and he winds up alone. And he suffers an ignominious death that no one is a shameful end. Well, this is not the fate of the Messiah. Even to say Jesus was raised from the dead, to my knowledge, there was no Jewish expectation that you will know the Messiah because he was raised from the dead. Is it correct, Murray? Do we have anything on that? Yes. So it's not like, oh, the resurrection proves that Jesus was the Messiah. At a public level, Jesus was not a very good Messiah because the Romans were still there. The Jews were still oppressed. In fact, a lot of the messianic expectation would be that the Messiah would be a great warrior, and Jesus seems to be a pacifist. People in today's world don't like to hear that Jesus was a pacifist, but let's just be very clear. Jesus was a pacifist. He talked about loving your enemies. He talked about turning the other cheek. He never said, well, there are exceptions to this rule, and when those exceptions come, then mount an army and go clobber people. Jesus seemed to be a radical pacifist, which doesn't fit Jewish messianic expectation at all. During Jesus' lifetime, there's some interesting nuances to this in the gospel story. For instance, Jesus does various things, and sometimes somebody thinks that he's the Messiah, and what does Jesus do? Jesus says, shh, don't tell anybody, which is kind of interesting. Jesus seems himself to have some reticence. You don't really have passages where Jesus stands up and says, yes, I am the Messiah. I'm here. You've been waiting for me. I have finally come. Let's join. Jesus just does not do this. And when people say he is the Messiah, if anything, Jesus is hushing them. It reminds me of that hilarious, it may not be hilarious to you now that I'm thinking about it, that hilarious scene in the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, right? And there's some people and they mistake Brian for the Messiah, and they're following around saying, he is the Messiah. And he says, I'm not the Messiah. I say, no, you are the Messiah. So finally this gets on his nerves and he says, okay, I am the Messiah. And then they all say, he is the Messiah. Because only the true Messiah would deny his messiahship. It wasn't funny. I knew that would not work. Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, are you the Messiah? And Jesus' answer in Mark 14:62 isn't yes. And it's not no. Jesus says, well, you have said so. What does that mean, right? He's not accepting it, but he's not denying it. And I think that's pretty important. Justin Martyr, who was a Christian theologian in the 2nd century, developed a notion that the Messiah would only be revealed after the fact, and that the Messiah may not even be aware himself that he was the Messiah. That's interesting. Sometimes people ask me, did Jesus think that he was the Messiah? Actually, I have 2 different answers to that, and I don't know which one is correct. You can help me. We could vote when I'm done. My first answer that I'm actually very fond of is the following. Did Jesus think that he was the Messiah? My answer that I've given for a long time is that Jesus was a supremely unself-conscious person, if you get your mind around this. You and I are very self-conscious people. We think about ourselves, we think about how we're doing. If we stand up in front of people, we're nervous. We wonder, did they like me? We're very self-conscious. We get kind of obsessed with ourselves. We're the kind of people who always need to be told, it's not about you. Does anyone ever tell you that? It's so rude, isn't it? It's not about you. We need to be told this constantly. Lisa, this is her job at home. I should have mentioned Lisa is here. I don't know if you saw this news story the other day where this pastor's wife paid a woman to pose as the pastor's wife, and she sat down in front of the church for 2 years. But that is Lisa there tonight. I'm sure of it. So I like this idea that Jesus is not obsessed with himself. Jesus is totally transparent to God. Jesus is totally into God. Jesus is totally into the people who are in front of him. So Jesus didn't spend a lot of time obsessing on, who am I? What is my identity? I like that answer. Did Jesus think that he was the Messiah? But there's another answer that may actually be better historically. It seems that Jesus allowed the idea to circulate that he was the Messiah. There are examples of this. Matthew chapter 16, Jesus goes to Caesarea Philippi. Ben Witherington talked about this moment last week. He goes to Caesarea Philippi, and he gets his disciples there, and he says, who do people say that I am? And they have a whole bunch of answers, and one is Peter's, where Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah. And what Jesus does is he doesn't say, right, you get an A+ on your theology exam. What Jesus actually does is he diverts that and talks about the suffering that is to come, that he must go to Jerusalem, that he must die, that he must suffer, that he must be raised again. It's interesting that for Jesus, when he does talk about himself, he doesn't say, I am the Messiah. Who he says he is I am the Son of Man, which was another Old Testament figure, which was not necessarily a human figure, but had more the nuance of a divine figure that would come down. So Jesus didn't seem focused on, yes, I'm the Messiah, and that sums up who I am. Jesus had other ideas about his identity. The other time that Jesus seems to be kind of messianic is, of course, on Palm Sunday. What does Jesus do? He gets on a donkey, they wave branches, he comes into the city. This seems to be a messianic moment. He seems to be fulfilling this prophecy from Zechariah about what it would be like when the Messiah comes. The difficulty with that is that Jesus comes into the city and people are really jacked up about it, but they're immediately crushed because what? He has no weapon. He tells those around him, do not get weapon. So even in his most messianic moment, he does it in a remarkably un-messianic way. Jesus is almost the anti-expected Messiah, if you will. So the only thing that we can conclude from all of this as Christians is that if Jesus is the Messiah, and we have the claim that he's the Messiah, it's his last name, Jesus Christ. If Jesus is the Messiah, he is totally transforming what it means to be the Messiah as opposed to what everyone expected. Or another alternative, which I think is actually pretty interesting, and it does fit with that Martin Buber idea, is that Jesus came as the Messiah, not all that focused on it himself, but he came in a proleptic way. Instead of coming, I was interested to watch Murray's body language. Did you see it? When he talked about the coming of the Messiah, this is the beginning of the debate. We're going now. When he talked about the coming of the Messiah, did you see it? He was doing this, right? When the Messiah comes. And that is body language that doesn't match what Jesus was about. Jesus is never the fighting, clenched fist. Jesus is the gentle embrace, love your enemies. Now, is that just a total redefinition of what the Messiah is? We still have this language in the Bible that the Messiah will return and you'll get this. You'll get the big victory, right? You'll get the strength. So maybe the idea is that the Messiah comes in a proleptic way to open up a new stage of history, if you will, in which humanity is invited to be different. Instead of being the kind of people until the Messiah returns who act like this, we're going to be strong, we're going to crush our foes. Instead, we become the people who are like Jesus. We love. We're gentle. We don't crush other people, we embrace other people. And that's really hard to do in the world, because it's a dangerous world out there. And to do so invites mockery, it invites scorn, it invites downright peril for you. But Jesus invites people to be that way, to live as an alternative kind of messianic community until the Messiah truly returns and all rights are wronged and there's finally a victory. I think, and I'm almost done, I think at the end of the day, identify this, some Christians will get really annoyed with me for this, but I think it's important. At the end of the day, Christianity is not primarily about the claim that Jesus was the Messiah. Christians believed what they believed about Jesus. They got very jacked up about Jesus. They thought he was the greatest ever. They put their livelihoods behind them and followed him, not because they thought he was the Messiah. They did that because of what? He was raised from the dead. And once somebody has taught and healed and done all these amazing things and died, but then raised from the dead, he becomes everything. There's a theologian, he's retired now, at Yale, named George Lindbeck. And George Lindbeck says Christians always engage in a kind of maximalism. It's kind of like young lovers. If you ask a young lover, tell me about her, they never say, well, she's kind of cute on Tuesdays. Right? When you're in love, you're like, oh, she's the most beautiful, she's the most brilliant, she's the most, you just can't stop saying amazing things about it. The Christians did this. They said, Jesus is everything. So they began to attach all kinds of, he's the Son of Man, he's the Son of God. And if you're all these things, you certainly are the Messiah, but that's kind of one more thing. I, as a Christian, choose not to focus very much on saying Jesus is the Messiah. Why? I find that to be very divisive with respect to a group of people in my world with whom I want to be friends. You see, when Christians say Jesus is the Messiah, we're kind of co-opting something that belongs to somebody else, and we're saying it's ours and it's not yours anymore. And it can even lead to that old idea that we're right and you're wrong, we're brilliant, and you were really a numbskull for not to accept that, and we don't feel that way. Well, there are Christians who do feel that way about it. But we don't wish to feel that way about it. So I don't spend much mental energy at all on thinking of Jesus as the Messiah. I spend a lot of time thinking of him as Savior, as the one raised from the dead, as God incarnate. These are bigger things even than being the Messiah. And one of the reasons is the burden is on us to be friends with one another. We're always in a season of listening. Murray, come back up here. And let's talk with each other and then get them to talk with us. I'm going to ask you when you get up here to tell me not so much what you think about what I just said, but what do you, as, maybe not just as rabbi, but as a Jewish person, what do you think of Christians calling Jesus Christ?
Well, I'm going to be honest. When I hear Christians talking about Jesus as Christ, I get a little queasy. I get a little weak in the knees, because generally after Jesus as Christ comes and you're the Christ killers. And that's, oh, don't make faces, my dear. I faced that many times in my life, and I will tell you that Jewish children in the school system here in Charlotte face it each and every day. Each and every day, starting in first grade. I had a phone call from a member of my congregation last week. My 7-year-old just got a phone call from a friend of his saying, "You're not invited to my birthday party." He said, "Why not? I thought we were friends." He says, "Well, we were, but I just found out you're a Christ killer, so we can't be friends anymore." All right? It's a very serious thing. In fact, that is the basis for early anti-Semitism. So there's this tendency for us to fall back on early experiences. And I, by the way, am very willing to say that Jesus is your Messiah. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with your accepting Jesus as the Messiah for you. But Jesus isn't my Messiah. And as I said yesterday, perhaps a little mistakenly, at a Baptist church on Sunday, when Moses went up the mountain, he took one path. There are many other paths up that mountain to God. Mine isn't the only one. Yours isn't the only one. And I saw the looks on people's faces. I knew I made a mistake. But I firmly believe that. I'm not going to limit God by saying that there's only one way for God to express God's divine being to human beings who are much more limited than God is. I would like to add something else about Jesus. Most people today are aware that Jesus does not appear in the Talmud. And that's because in the 14 and 1500s, Christian editors took Jesus out of the Talmud. And that was because most of the things that were being said about Jesus were not the best. There are two major storylines about Jesus in the Talmud, and there are probably 15 to 20 total references, which we've been able to piece back together from early manuscripts of the Talmud. One says that he was the student of Yehoshua ben Parachia, who was chased out of Israel and had to go live in Egypt for a long time. And so Jesus goes to Egypt to see Yehoshua ben Parachia. And they had a big fight. And Jesus wanted to make up, according to the story in the Talmud. And he comes into the study room when Yehoshua ben Parachia is in the middle of a lecture. And he sees Jesus in the back, and Jesus is walking forward. And he goes like this. Just give me a minute to finish. Jesus says, "That's stop, get out of here," and leaves. And that's, according to this Talmudic story, what his personality was like. If you didn't listen to him the first time, forget it. There's a problem here, though, and that's Yehoshua ben Parachia lived around 100 BCE and was dead by 50 BCE. The other storyline is about a man by the name of Ben Stada, who was crucified. The story is right out of the New Testament, I'll tell you, or at least it appears to be, except that he was stoned and then he was hung, because anyone who was stoned for a biblical crime was then hung for the rest of the day, and at nighttime the body was taken down and buried. And then there's several chapters later, there's another rendition of the story which says he was hung in the fashion of the Romans, which means crucifixion. The only problem with Ben Stada is that the names don't coincide at all. The timing could be okay, although it's probably a little late. But they go after his mommy and talk about her being a harlot and a disloyal wife, sleeping around, getting pregnant with a Roman soldier, and all this stuff. So any way you look at it, whatever references there are in the Talmud that may or may not be referring to Jesus were very negative, and therefore were removed. And of course, when you're given the choice to remove a couple of stories from the Talmud or have the entire community killed, you take the stories out of the Talmud. It's not worth the other side of it. So,
talk about something I see as a a odd negative in Christians focusing a lot on Jesus as Messiah, and that would be, these so-called these messianic Christians who are kind of bent on converting you guys. Talk some about that and experiences you've had and your view of them.
I love James. He's a really nice guy. And you know what is best about him? He doesn't lie. He doesn't pull his punches. He talks straightforward, eye to eye, face to face, human being to human being. And I believe you can trust everything he says. I am really not happy about people who aren't willing to tell me who they are. Most people who are Messianic Jews are not, nor have they ever been Jewish. And if you go to the websites, you'll find out that most of these places now call themselves Messianic Jews or Messianic Christians or Messianic whatevers, and a community of Jews and Gentiles. So they're being a little bit more honest, not much. And yeah, it's very difficult. They will go to the sick and the elderly, people who are afraid of dying, and offer them chances to save their souls by converting. And they take advantage of the people in most need. And what they do is they take things like matzah on Passover. Now, you've been to my house for Passover. Lisa was there. There she is. And we serve wine. We have 4 cups of wine. We eat a lot of matzah. But at no point of time in a traditional Jewish Seder is Jesus ever referred to, let alone the matzah being referred to as his body and the wine as his blood, which in Messianic Haggadahs, the book used at Passover time, they make a big deal out of it. But Jews coming to the Seder see wine and matzah, and they think, maybe there's something here. And there's this big lie. And I think Christianity is a beautiful religion. I don't see any reason for any Christian to be ashamed of who they are or what they believe. And yet, these folk are afraid to tell people that they're really Christians, and they're trying to convert you to Christianity. They want you to think that you can remain Jewish and change your entire religious theology. And that's very difficult. Of course, I can tell you, I'm a direct descendant of the Messiah, James. And if you give up the belief in this guy, Jesus, I can bring you to a life of joy.
You've heard of James, the brother of our Lord?
Yes. You mean Yaakov? Yes, I know him. And I hate to be so negative, but people who are religious people really need to be straightforward and preach what they believe and not what they would like to be the reality. But I have a question for you. I am not surprised completely by your statements about finding other more important areas of the personality and personage of Jesus in Christian tradition, Savior, etc. But if that's the case, why is the Messiahship so important to so many?
That's a great question. And it's probably important to different people for different reasons. Some people find great security in kind of easy, simple answers where everything is tied up very neatly, right? I've never been one of those, but I've loved many of them. If you're the kind of person that you need everything tied up very neatly, everything's got to be logical, everything has got to fit together, then it's very difficult to deal with this idea of saying Jesus is Messiah, but he doesn't fit the expectation of Messiah. That becomes hard. So I think those people are inclined to be fond of teachings that say he really was the predicted Messiah. It really does all tie together. Look at this. Here's what this really means. That helps people like that. There is I read this, to prepare for tonight, I read the series of essays by Jewish and Christian scholars on kind of the relationship of Judaism and Christianity. And one writer, I thought this was pretty interesting. He said, one of the problems with saying anybody in particular is the Messiah, but specifically when Christians say Jesus is the Messiah, he has come, it's done. The problem with that is twofold. One is it's a way of endorsing the existing order as the way things are in the world. There are always people I know who want to do that. They always say, God's will is always done. And this is always a huge puzzle to me, right? Like Duke lost last year. I'm kidding. It's nothing that silly. People want to say God has ordained things to be just the way they are. They're not paying any attention to what's going on in the world. If God ordained things to be the way they were, we wouldn't have this Penn State University athletic scandal. None of you in this room would have had your heart shattered by somebody you loved who stopped loving you. You see what I'm saying? Just God's will isn't done all the time. So to bless the existing order, that's silly. Those who tend to want to bless the existing order are those who benefit from it. And the same writer said the danger of saying the Messiah has come and he's ours is that it induces a kind of superiority and a judgmental attitude on everybody else in the world, which I would suggest is a manifestly unchristian way of feeling about other people. You know, if you're attentive to what Jesus was about, he just doesn't walk around and pronounce judgment on people. Well, he does, actually. Who does Jesus pronounce judgment on? It's not the wicked people. It's not the foreigners. The only people he has judgment for are the what? Supremely, ultra pious who what? They have God all figured out. They are entirely, Jesus has no patience with this, right? Because Jesus is all about humility. They're the very people who use religion as a blunt instrument to wound others, and Jesus won't have it, right? So to say that we're superior because we have the Messiah and you were wrong, that this endorses the worst kinds of attitudes that become problematical in the world. Some people like that. They want to be in the know. They want to be in the superior group. They're going to be winners. It's just interesting. In early Christianity, one of the criticisms leveled against Christianity that said it can't be true is that Christians were just like duds. There was this guy named Celsus who wrote a book against Origen. And he said, Christians are such losers. I mean, just look around. The people in your community who are Christians, like they're the poorest people. They got the worst jobs. They're not successful. They're not getting ahead in the world. What kind of religion is that? So we're supposed to laugh at ourselves at this point. You're a bunch of losers. A lot of people don't like to be losers. They want to be winners. They want to be the ones who are on top. And so that makes that kind of thinking appealing to them, I think. We're not a people in America in the year 2012 who cope at all well with difference. And this is a great surprise to me, because I think about someone like my grandfather who grew up in Oakboro, North Carolina. I wonder if he ever met a Jewish person. You know, I wonder if you know what I'm saying? He'd never been to another country. TV was pretty primitive then. You couldn't see much of the world. Now we're actually exposed to so much, and we can meet so many different kinds of people. And coinciding with that has been, don't you think, has been this kind of increasing narrowness and an inability to deal with difference. I don't know if that's an insecurity or Jean Bethke Elshtain, who's a sociologist, says, you know, kind of the tragedy of democracy in our day is that we've forgotten how to disagree with each other. The virtue of democracy ought to be that we can disagree with one another. We don't have to kill each other. You know, in a dictatorship, if you disagree, you get killed, right? But in America, it ought to be a lovely thing to be able to disagree, but we're not good at this, as you can tell from political life and all the rancor that's out in public. That's a rambling answer.
We ramble often. What can I say? We're religious people. We have so much to say and so many different perspectives that are confronting each other within us. You know, one of the things that Jews believe that the angels' envy of human beings is that we grow and change, and they can't. They are created as they are with one task and one task only, whereas we are born as infants who cannot take care of ourselves, And by the time we have infants and our infants have infants and it's time for us to leave the world, you can't even recognize us as the same being that was born so long ago. And that's something that is, the rabbis have always seen the angels to be jealous of in us. And I think that is the strongest attribute of humanity, is that we learn and we change. We change with experience and we change with knowledge. And when I was growing up, sessions like we have wouldn't take place. I grew up in Rock Island, Illinois, which is a small town on the Mississippi River. And I remember our rabbi took us into church, 2 different churches, during our confirmation class. They were the only 2 that would let us in, by the way. You know, the world is changing, and yeah, I think we have a tremendous difficulty dealing with difference, and that's why I think our friendship is so important, that we are an example to people that we don't have to be the same to be friends and be respectful of each other.
Yeah, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and I was just thinking yesterday, the degree to which when I was a little boy, I don't know who told me this. I was sort of told that Martin Luther King was a terribly evil person, a grave threat to the security and goodness of the United States of America. It's interesting, isn't it? That's what I heard growing up. We're off topic. Let's talk about the Messiah, or Judaism and Christianity, or God. What would you want to ask us, either together or one or the other? Yes, in the red shirt in the back. I can't see that far.
Dr. Howell, you said that those who say Jesus is the Christ are endorsing the status quo, but wasn't it because the early Christians realized that there was something wrong with the status quo, that the church fathers came up with the doctrine of a second coming, whereas there isn't really anything in the prophets that says that the Messiah will have to come twice?
Well, let's see. It's harder to stand up and talk in front of people than it appears to be. So it's easy to misspeak. When I was saying Christians who say Jesus is the Messiah are blessing the status quo, I don't mean all of them, but I mean that's a tendency that we can fall into if we say, yes, he's the Messiah, and if you don't think so, you're wrong. See, that can be a blessing of life as we know it. Certainly, in early Christianity, I just think this is correct. In early Christianity, there's not much arrogance because Christians are so small. They're barely surviving for years. I mean, the statistical numbers are amazing. 100 years after Jesus dies, Christians as a percentage of the population of the Roman world is like 0.001%. I mean, it took them a long time to get to 1% of the population. They're small, they're endangered. They're not happy with the way things are in the world. And I always think that should be sort of a permanent posture that I would think not just Christians, but the Jews would harbor in our souls, right? Because you look around the world and it's a mess. And the danger is whenever we do bless the order. I mean, a lot of Christian theologians think it was a dark day when Constantine became emperor in Rome. And he basically said, the empire shall be Christian from now on. And that's not good, because then being a Christian is the same thing as having a pulse. There are a lot of people with a pulse who are not very Christian, see? And then what happens to those who aren't Christian in an empire that has been deemed to be Christian? Well, we know what happens to them. There's violence, and there's the most horrific treatment possible is what happens. So we should always have an unrest with what we see in the world, because one of the things that we both know is that human beings are broken. Human beings are sinful. Human beings veer away from what God has called us to. And therefore, we're always about the business of the correction of human behavior, the need for forgiveness and redemption, and so on. Doc, please.
I don't really believe that all these things the church tells us, but I believe Jesus is my personal Messiah, and I don't have to believe all that because he enriches my life if I follow the teachings. And so I don't think it's important that we do, whether the church or whether the synagogue says he's the Messiah. That's just my own opinion. Can't we each take Jesus as our own Messiah?
Doc's asking about that Jesus is his personal Messiah, his personal Savior. He says he doesn't have to accept church teaching. That's okay as long as you accept what I say. Right? Yeah.
He's here, isn't he?
I appreciate what you're saying. My only quibble with that is to say, Jesus is my personal Savior and I'm not worried about, to me that feels really lonely. I don't want to do this alone. I have no desire to do it alone. And if I have to do it alone, I'm going to do it really poorly alone. I was working on an email. I send emails out to the Christians in the crowd. It's like a life sentence. Like somebody said, 3 years after I'm dead, you'll still be getting emails from me that just come forever. So I was working on one that's about a year in advance, I hate to admit, this morning. And it's the story where, this is a great story. Jesus is in Capernaum, and he's in the house, and the house is really crowded, and nobody can get in there any longer. But there are 4 guys who have a guy who's paralyzed, and they want to bring him to Jesus. So they climb up on the roof, and they dig a hole in the roof, and they lower the guy to Jesus, and Jesus heals the guy. And what's amazing I'm tipping off my email. You won't read it now. And what's amazing in the story is they lower the guy, and Mark says, in chapter 2, it says, when Jesus saw their faith, he healed him. You'd think he would say, when Jesus saw his faith, right, the guy that got drugged there, he healed him. But no, it's when he saw their faith, the 4 people that dragged him there, he healed the other guy. That's interesting. And I like that. Because I bet all of us have times that on our own we can't believe, or it's hard to believe, or we're at a dark time. But if I'm in a community with other people, there are others who can believe for me when I can't believe. There's others whose strong faith will carry me through when mine is impotent. So, it has to be personal. It's got to be my belief, but I don't really want to do it alone. I want to do it with other people. It's part of why I do what I do for a living. I want us to do this together. We don't have to absolutely agree on every point, but the idea of talking about it is going to help us to grow and I think overcome that loneliness. We got enough loneliness in the world, don't we? Without having it in our religious life. Somehow the religious life ought to be a cure for that deep loneliness that we feel through our lives.
We live in a community like you're talking about, in Aldersgate. And these are people, and I think we share our beliefs. We don't all believe the same, but we support each other. It's not lonely.
One of the real strengths of the Jewish community, we have this concept that we need a minyan. You can't pray completely alone. To have a full prayer, you need a community of at least 10 adults. And if you think about it, that means that all the fears that we have about meeting God face to face are lessened a little bit because we know we're not going to be alone. There are 9 other people who are going to be with us, and it makes it a little easier to talk to God. But it also means that there are 9 other people standing with you who believe similarly to you. I say similarly because I don't think any 2 people believe exactly the same. We may use the same words, but we believe a little bit differently in our minds and hearts.
You have 2 Jews and there would be 3 opinions?
At least. In fact, the rabbis of the Talmud go so far in arguments that one of the very common responses at the end of an argument is teku. There's no decision. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. They're both the words of the living God.
It's good. I like that. Others? Yes.
I would like to hear what, from each standpoint, what you mean by the Messiah.
I have the easier answer. From the Jewish perspective, the Messiah, what do I mean and what does James mean when we use the term Messiah? Fair enough? I believe that the Messiah will be the next Davidic king who brings Israel together, he reunites the people, and reestablishes a kingdom in Israel. The eschatological part of Messianism doesn't come into our tradition until the early Middle Ages, really. The Messiah and eschatology existed side by side, but were not dependent or related to each other in ancient Israel. So the combination comes much later. Once that Davidic king reunites Israel and reestablishes the monarchy, then God will return to the earth and the prophecies will come true.
And it's that person that it will reuniting Israel. Is that what you're saying, Messiah?
Those who believe in a personal Messiah would say yes. But there are many Jews, starting with most notably starting with the Reform movement with the Pittsburgh Platform in the early of the 20th century, who believe that there will not be a personal Messiah, but only a messianic era.
And I would just go back to the Hebrew word Messiah. Mashiach means the anointed one. We have in our Bible many Messiahs. The Davidic kings were anointed. If you were walking in the streets of Jerusalem, who's the Messiah? It'd be like saying, who's the president? It's Obama, right? So those were anointed ones. Those were Messiahs. Cyrus, it's really interesting, right? The king of Persia in the prophet Isaiah is called the Messiah, the anointed one. And then we think of Jesus as the Messiah, the anointed one. So for that role for Jesus, I would say it's fitting in that the Messiah would be the anointed one, the one that God has called forth in a special way to redeem God's people. And I like the image related to Cyrus of to bring them home. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I will go back to Savannah, Georgia, where I was born. To bring them home in more of a mystical, spiritual sense that we'll be reunited with one another and with God ultimately. And to say, as a Christian, that Jesus is the one that fills that role, I'm comfortable with that. But the way I prefer to think about it and the grander, more profound ways to think about it for me are not around thinking of Jesus as the anointed one, but thinking of him as God come down to earth, our Savior, Son of God, Son of those other titles are more pregnant with meaning.
Yeah, the word Messiah doesn't come into my personal worship. It's pray to God, pray in the name of Christ.
Others. Yes, your hand's been up a few times.
Is there an Islamic concept of Messiah? And if there is, how does it differ? Is there an Islamic concept of Messiah?
Oh, Islamic.
I gave Michael a sheet here that says Islam believes that that Jesus was the Messiah.
Yeah, Doc said, I don't know what he's pointing to. Doc said that somebody's got a sheet that says Muslims say Jesus was the Messiah. I'm always very hesitant to speak on behalf of anybody else's religion. I used to be cockier about that. Like when I was 22, I taught a class on world religions, and I told you all about Buddhism. How in the world would I know much about Buddhism? Like, I read a book, as opposed to whole cultures that have been in the middle of this with all of every breath that they've ever taken for generations. Anyhow, Islam is especially dicey these days. People come to me all the time, and they've got something or another that's the truth about Islam, and it's something that they Googled and they found it on the internet, and there's all kinds of stuff on the internet about various religions, but especially about Islam, given what's going on in our day. My best understanding is that Muslims are not against Jesus, but they do not grant him any divine, of course they don't grant him any divine status, because there is one God, and that one God is Allah. So they see Jesus as a great prophet, but to my knowledge, that's about all.
As well as Moses, and they accept the writings of the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, as well as the Christian Bible, as authoritative to some degree. But that's as far as my knowledge goes right now.
All right, other questions? Yes, Mark.
I'd like to ask this question to both of you. Why is it necessary for us to go beyond the wise words of Martin Buber? When the answer comes, when the Messiah comes, and he does answer the question, she or she, as the case may be, does answer the question, one of us will say, oops, got that wrong. Other than that, why does it matter?
I don't know if you could hear Mark's question. He was saying that, to go back to the Buber thing, we're both awaiting the Messiah, and when he comes, the worst is that one group of us will say, oops. And I always like that principle, by the way. I don't know if it applies in this case, but maybe it does. But I like this a lot. For instance, a lot of times I'll say something about, for instance, let's see if I can get in trouble on this right off the bat. Various biblical stories, are they historically true or not? Let's take the story of Jonah and the fish, right? Here's a story, Jonah swallowed by fish, lives in the fish for 3 days. Okay, I say that sounds like a made-up story. It's got every element. Yeah. It's got every element of kind of mythology, childhood story from Jonah's name to all this. Okay, now, what I always like to say is that, when I die and God says, James, there really was a guy, and he was in that fish for 3 days. I'll say, God, sorry, right? I mean, the Bible doesn't teach thou shalt be saved because you believe Jonah really was in a fish, right? We're saved by the grace of God. We're saved by larger things. Now, but that gets to the question on this, is this one on which we can just disagree because it's such a big thing, right? Because many Christians have said to be saved, you must accept Jesus. So that puts a different twist on the question of, are we just waiting for the Messiah together? I think within all forms of Christianity, there's very good cause. Oh, this sounds dumb, but I think it's right. We have good cause always to be utterly inclusive of, above all other people, the Jews, because of language that's in the Apostle Paul, because of 1,000 reasons. So you talk about that.
Oh, look, let's be honest about it. Jesus was Jewish. And if it was good enough for him, I'm going to go a step further than James did. Did you ever hear of the book of, what do they call it? Oh, Genesis. I do not believe that the book of Genesis is authoritative. I think it is prehistory. I think it explains a number of traditions that people had as to what happened. I do not take it as authoritative. And in fact, the rabbis of old, no matter how much they tell you it is, didn't either. And how do I know that? Because they only have 3 laws that come out of Genesis. If it were authoritative, if it was written by God, if it was there, like the other 4 books of the Torah, there would be many other laws that had been taken from it. But they're moral teachings. Why was the world destroyed by flood? Everyone knew there was a great flood at some point that destroyed everything. They knew. The fact that people were violent, great rationale. God goofed. God made a mistake. Do you realize that? The whole story of the flood is because God wasn't as good as God thought God was. God created human beings, and they did something God could not even imagine. They started killing each other and killing animals, even though God had told them not to. So God destroys the world and starts over again with the closest thing to a good guy he could find, that being Noah and his family. They weren't a lot better than the others, as we can see today, because we're not all that much better than the people who lived in the time of Noah. I don't remember the question that started this whole thing. And the Bible changes in the book of Exodus. The Bible changes. Now we're talking about a story that is being passed on, we believe, by the people who were there. And that's different. What's wrong? You weren't there. You don't have to take responsibility. But, this Moses character, these are strange stories here. What happened at the Red Sea? Wouldn't you like to know? I would love to know. Do you believe what it says in the Bible? I don't know. Bible's got a great story. Sea splitting, people going through on semi-dry land. Something happened. Something major happened because it's stuck in the historic memory of the people of Israel. What exactly it was, I don't know. And the worst part about it was none of this was written down. It was all published verbally because the Hebrew language, the language in which the Bible is, or the original Hebrew Bible is written, doesn't come into existence for almost, 1,800 years. There was no alphabetic language. There was what? Can you imagine this story in cuneiform or hieroglyphics? It would take up the entire city of Charlotte. You can't write it all down. But by golly, there's something special in you. And we know it. Just for a second, look into the eyes of the person next to you. And tell me if you don't see a light in their pupil. Is there anyone here who doesn't see the light in the pupil of the person sitting next to them? Good, because that light is the reflection of your soul, I believe. There's a piece of God that was torn off of God and put into you. And we can't prove it, but we can see its reflection in our eye. And I think that light is there for us to remember every time we're talking to each other and we want to fight about who God is and what God is. By golly, your God, as much as the person next to you, as much as anyone in history, was God. You are as close to God as a human being can get. But we have to act that way. What I believe is the major difference between Christianity and Judaism is not Jesus. It's this emphasis that I have always been taught Christianity has on the next world. You do what you do, you believe what you believe to get into heaven. In Judaism, you do what you do because you're commanded to do it here in earth to make this world better. And there's a promise that something better will exist in the next world, but that's not the goal. The goal is to live your life the best you can. And that's where our emphasis is.
And let me disagree.
Please
with
go
what you
ahead.
just said. I was thinking about the light in the eye. I think this pertains to this. We're Methodists, Murray. It's different. There are many Christians who Christianity is about kind of getting that passage into heaven. That's the reason that you bother. But like I said, we're Methodist, and Methodist in classic ways, that's not our emphasis so much. John Wesley was big on holiness, social holiness, private holiness. Am I holy in my soul? What do I watch? What do I think? What do I say? Am I holy? Am I socially holy? Am I serving the poor? Am I reaching out to make a difference in the world? So Methodists tend to have a very this-worldly function. I would say the difference, because I thought of this, Mark, when you asked about what's the difference? We're just waiting together for the Messiah. It's important. I hope none of you are looking at us thinking all religions are the same, because our two religions are not the same. And even saying they're all equally valid, there's a little bit of me, I'm always hesitant to do it because it's like bad form and we're all about friendship. There's a little part of me that, my kids get, they laugh. Like I'll say, Lisa's the most beautiful woman. They're kind of like, yeah, Dad, yeah. But like, if you're a good husband, like that's your stick. I mean, she is. Like, and I'm going to argue with you if you tell me she's not, right? You get this kind of, Mother Teresa once said, "I love all religions, but I'm in love with my own." We have a special feeling. We're not. Yours is just as good as mine. There's something to me that wants to say, "No, we got something that's really cool and special. Let me tell you about it." Or else, why bother, right? If you don't have that, I mean, gee. So I'm talking about the difference. This actually came out when you and I did a program on the Torah, if you remember this. And this was really enlightening to some folks, and I heard a lot about it over the next few days, is that, I don't want to speak for you, but in Judaism, it's all about the keeping of commandments, right? And in Christianity, it's not all about keeping commandments. It's about the grace and mercy of God. Now, we could duke that out, and I don't know who the winner would be. I assume I could win that, but I don't. And let me make a suggestion for you in terms of that light in the eye of the other person, that maybe it's a virtue that if we duke that out, there would not be a clear winner. Because the fact is, in your life, there are actually two things that are really important. Some of the saddest people I know are great behaviors. You know what I'm saying? They always do the right thing. They've never done anything wrong. They're really good. You know the kind of people I'm talking about? And there's this kind of tragic sadness in them because they're always doing the right thing. But you want to say, loosen up, laugh, make a mistake, fall on your face. It's funny. Well, it wouldn't be funny if I fell on my face, but it'd be funny if others fell on their faces, right? And so what we also discover that we need is this kind of grace, this kind of unconditional love. And that's why Jesus tells the story about there's a father who had two sons, and they both are clueless with what their father is about, and the father loves them. And every one of us in this room needs that. And the fact is we need both of these things, right? Because what happens when people are just like grace people? Like, they love me no matter what. You can become kind of a lousy person, and you don't really want to be a lousy person. You want to be a good person. You want to be a behavior. You want to do good. So it's not bad that there's not a clear winner in that debate.
Well, I'm not so sure. Although I agree with you, James, that, and if I said that all religions are equally valid to me, that's not true. Okay, to me, Judaism is the religion. As I hope to you, Christianity is the religion, and I would hope to Muslims, Islam is, etc., all around the world, all the religions. But to me, Judaism is the religion. That doesn't mean that there isn't a path for Christians to God through Christianity. It's different, and it's not for me. Okay, so I'm not sure that I'm saying they're all equal. The other thing is, what you have to get to through Jesus, this love and grace and all that, we get automatically. And when I say we believe all human beings are unconditionally loved by God. And it's up to us to finish God's work here. And if we finish God's work, if we do what God wants us to do, the sense of commandedness is important to Judaism, because if you work on the assumption that everyone is unconditionally loved by God, then anyone can do anything they want and live a happy life and not have any fear about anything. But if there's this commandedness to finish God's work, you see, God never finishes creation. If you read those first few sentences of the second chapter of Genesis in the Bible, that book that I don't really believe is authentic and authoritarian, it says that God stopped working. It doesn't say really that God finished. And therefore, it's up to us to finish God's work. That's why we believe that there's a piece of God within us to give us the ability to do that. And we do so, we accept that command because we know that God loves us and we love God.
I'm going to take one more question. Yes. It better be a good one, by the way. I'm kidding. Go ahead, please.
There's only one God. Why don't all of us, aren't we praying to the same person? If you believe in God, what's the difference between the God of the Christian and the God of the Jews? It's only one.
There's a Christian theologian at Yale named Miroslav Volf. He wrote a very controversial book last year. Its title is Islam. No, the title of the book is Allah. And the question of the book is, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And he's from Croatia, and he grew up in the middle of some pretty thick warfare around Christianity and Islam, right? his answer in that book is really pretty interesting. His answer is, yes, there's only one God. Of course, we worship the same God. And he delineates this in great detail. What's interesting about that, though, that strikes me as important, is that of course, there's only one God. If we're worshiping some God or praying to some God, there is only one God. But I find, this is not the best analogy, but I'll try it. I find that I, as a guy, as a minister, as a father, as a husband, as whatever it is that I am, I want to be known for who I really am. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you could say, he's a dad, and that's all I need to know about him. But that's not true, right? Because they're dads, and there are dads. And I'm one of the kinds of dads that when my kids go off to college, I'm not saying, yeah, I got them out of the house. I'm the kind of dad that's in a funk for a few months. That's the kind of dad that I am. And if you want to know the truth about me, that's the kind of dad. What kind of minister? You say, oh, he's a minister. I know all I need to know about him. But there's a way that I do this that matters to me. So Volf says there is some true character of God. Now, what he'd say is no one religion gets a corner on that. And I think it's important, right? But you can't just say, well, there's just God and it's really all the same, because God does have a character. God does have a way. From my viewpoint, there are things about Islam that, with all due respect to my Muslim friends, I would say are not as true to the heart of God as I know God as what I believe about God. Now, that's like the height of arrogance to say that, but I believe that in my heart. I'm always open to correction. I'm always open to learning more. But just to say it's all one God, that doesn't really help very much, because there's a character, there's a manner. Jesus came and said, God is like this, and he showed us a kind of God that actually is different from the Muslim God, right? And so I think God would want to be known for who God really is, in the same way that I want to be known for whom I really am.
Maybe the best analogy is the blind man and the elephant, and they all feel a different part of the elephant and think, oh, this is what the elephant is like, and the other one feels the trunk and one feels the tusk, and it's all the same elephant, but they all feel different parts of it.
You know, I'd look at it a little bit differently. I know that this woman sitting in the third row here is the most beautiful woman in the world to you. She's only second most beautiful to me. That's not to say she's not a beautiful woman. Okay? And I think the different approaches to God fulfill different needs for every human being. And I will say it again, the only way to God for me is through the Torah and Jewish history and tradition. And what our rabbis have taught, how our people have lived for all these centuries. It is beautiful, it is wonderful, it's marvelous, and I don't understand how Christians can believe everything Christians believe. I don't understand how Muslims can believe everything they believe. It's different, if not foreign, to me. That doesn't mean I'm afraid of it, and it doesn't mean that you don't have a good path to God. If in the end, you and I are working together to make this world a better place, and we're doing it because of what we believe God wants us to do, that's what's important to me.
And I would, one last quibble, I would add that that's pleasing to God. I think we would agree, and all of you in the room would agree, that not all religions are good. So we kind of make it sound like that. Your religion's good for you, and my religion's good for me. There's some religions that are bad for the people who believe them and for other people. There's some forms of religion that are mean. There's some forms of religion that are abusive. You know, David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. Ku Klux Klan, people who would claim to be Christians. They walk around burning crosses. It's a cross, right? They would say they're Christians. There are evil forms of religion, and I'm not willing for them to say, well, that's a good religion for that person. It's not for me. I think it's not for anybody. I think it's not for the people who are hurt by those people. And so we always want to hold on to that. But the reason, though, I think, is that we can have more in common than this because we are after the heart of this single God who believes in things, who seeks from us things like we're talking about, like making a difference in the world, loving, being friends, and so on.
And teaching each other and our friends that we can sit and talk about these things. I was asked the other day why I enjoy coming to Myers Park, having these programs with you. And I said, the reason is, even at those times that we disagree and we disagree strongly, even at those times that some people may think we're going after each other, every one of you who's sitting here this evening knows that we're friends. And we are not doing anything to hurt each other, but to enlighten ourselves as well as everyone who's here. And it's that openness that my religious belief, and I believe James' religious belief, gives to both of us to do this, to be able to do this. And not all religions allow that.
And I'd close with this little admonition. Might be a good little project for you for 2012. You're not past New Year's resolutions, right? It's only what's today? 17th, not too late. Make it a resolution this year to befriend someone of another faith. You can do this. And maybe not just talk about the weather, Carolina basketball. Talk about your life. Talk about what you believe. Talk about what you're afraid of. Talk about what you love. Talk about what matters to you. Tremendously enriching. We have the benefit, we kind of get to do this for a living, but then we get to be really friends, and it's cool. And I think one of the sadnesses in the city of Charlotte is there's so few friendships and there's so little understanding. And sometimes, we were talking about this beforehand, sometimes there's this fear of offending, right? Like you're afraid, I'll say something wrong or I'll serve him bacon or something, Like, oh gosh, it's terrible. What a faux pas. Don't be afraid. Right? Find somebody and you can do that. And you can laugh about it and you learn from each other and you say, why do you do that? And it's interesting to learn and we're all learning together. So that's my parting admonition. Thank you so much for coming tonight.